is we have first Dr. Kumudu Gunasekara, who will take us through challenges of infrastructure development. We have then Arnold from HSBC, who will speak about B2B and B2G financing models. Then we have presentation by Dr. Yasushi Taira, who will speak about G2G. And then we have two panelists joining, Tilan and Amali from World Bank, also to discuss PPP opportunities and also building the institutional capabilities. What we heard from Guido is, okay, if you have a project, there's money. Okay, but the question is not just getting money, but do we have the institutional capacity to identify the financing requirements, evaluate them, and put them to proper use? We heard from panelists that most of the time, okay, we are driven by funder proposals or by vendor proposals. Okay, so there's a huge challenge to the public sector. Okay, having that right talent, right institutional framework, and the governance system once again to manage, to identify sources of funding, evaluate them, and then manage the deployment. So the session chair is Maninda Wickramasinghe. Maninda has extensive experience in financial services, including used to work for infrastructure advisory at KPMG. So I will hand over to Maninda now.
Okay. Thank you, Lakshman. Good afternoon, everyone. And warm welcome to the panelists who are probably going to do most of the talking. I will guide them. We've talked about serious, numerous plans done by different people. We've talked about institutions. We've talked about projects that were never done, never implemented. Actually, this is the time the castle is still in the air. We are only trying to get it to ground now, because financial closure is what ultimately closes any transaction. If you cannot do that, there is no project. So all these gentlemen, I think, will talk about that. And that's the backdrop. So Kumudu, may I ask you to start your presentation?
Thanks, Maninda. Let me just open this up. How do you put this? Yeah. Not trying that. View screen available? It's loud. Window में Okay, sorry about that, guys. So my task today was to first talk about infrastructure finance, but at the same time to make sure that you guys don't fall asleep, because I know you guys had a very hefty lunch. So to ease into the presentation, what I thought is maybe we should go through a case study, something that I did about 5 years ago with the Panama Canal, in terms of understand, they faced the same type of situation, much larger scale, and they were able to fund one of the largest infrastructure projects that's currently ongoing. So I want to kind of take you through a case study, some of the challenges faced, and the takeaway from this case study is really about the negotiating power that they established early on. And they were able to take an upper hand in negotiating contracts, negotiating financing terms with financial institutions such as these guys. Because you should never let these guys take the upper hand, right? As a country, we need to take the upper hand. In terms of the Panama Canal, it's just a brief background. It's one of the world's most strategic waterways. It's very important to the US, especially east coast of US, which has most of the consumption in the world, and to China, which has most of the supply in the world. So in terms of shipments from Asia, from China to east coast US and Europe, Panama Canal becomes a critical waterway, right? The US understood very early on that the criticality of the Panama Canal. And in 1903, actually the French started building the Panama Canal early on. They couldn't, they failed. Many others tried as well. But then in 1903, US bought the rights to build the canal. In 1914, it took about 10 years to build the canal. They built the canal. But Panama itself was, it was a chaotic country. It was a dictatorship, right? Noriega, you guys may have heard of Noriega, who was a brutal dictator who's now serving time in jail. In 89, the US invades Panama. And then in 1999, something significant happened. Panama took control of the Panama Canal. Until 1999, the Panama Canal zone was owned and operated by the US. But in 1999, Panama took control of the canal. In 2004, they exceeded their revenues of more than $1 billion. In 2006, they had a referendum to say, let's expand the canal. What happened was there's a bottleneck. The demand was becoming more and more. Increasingly, there was congestion in the canal. Think of the canal as a tollway, a road, right? It's like the Gaul Road. It became like the Gaul Road where ships couldn't pass the canal. The Canal Authority realized that you needed to expand the canal, and they did some studies and came up with it needed $5.2 billion to expand the canal, build the third locks project. The financing was approved in 2008 during the height of the financial crisis. And now it's still the construction is still underway, but now they're in plans of actually early stage planning to build a fourth set of locks, which would cost about $17 billion. So I'm going through this timeline just to identify that this wasn't done in haste. It wasn't done, one day you got up and one politician got up and said, hey, I need to expand the canal. This was done over time. Now they are doing plans for the fourth set, which won't be even built or financed for another 10 years. But the planning has already begun. It's a quick picture of how the canal was built. It was built across mountainous areas. Basically dynamite was used to blast rock out. And this is what the canal is today, right? This is the two sets of locks. And it's an amazing engineering marvel, because these huge ships that are size of buildings go through this small passageway. And the critical thing is you can't mix salt water with fresh water. So there are tanks. The ship goes into a tank, goes down, then the water flushes out, goes to another tank, and then new water comes in. So there is only one tank that actually has fresh water and seawater mixed. And in the other side of the lock, the same thing happens. You have to elevate the ship to go. So it's an amazing technological feature that they built almost 100 years ago. The third set locks, just quickly, I'll explain what the third set locks is. There were 4 projects, that is building the third set of locks, expanding the Pacific Gateway, improving the navigation channels, and improving the water supply. With the new set of locks, they actually saved the waste of fresh water by 70%. So that was amazing environmental benefit from the new project as well. So this is all background. And actually this slide I really like. When you look at this, you say, okay, it's just a waterway. But to build this waterway, it's one of the largest infrastructure projects in terms of the amount of construction that is happening just to get one berth going. So this is actual construction that is underway right now. So I was involved in this project for about 5 years. I was working with the project finance team. I managed one of the teams in terms of securing funding for this project. The project was a well thought out project. It took 6 years of research and analysis to get to the point of going to the referendum. Because the voters, ultimately what the government did was to let the voters decide, do you want to expand the canal? Right. And in order to do that, you had to justify to the voters, justify to the financiers, and the engineering community, etc., that this is good. So 100+ studies was done. Ultimately, 2.9 billion was from revenue that from cash flow generated from the canal, and the rest was financed through different organizations. The key thing here is that when we went out to the market for this 2.3 billion financing, we created a lot of buzz around this, and we went to the private sector first. We went to private banks, and we secured some very good terms with private banks. Once the private banks agreed to fund this, in principle, then the interest for this arose, and we managed to negotiate very good terms with these development agency banks. And this was done all during the 2008 financial crisis. So in terms of the terms we agreed, we didn't need to get a state guarantee. The state of Panama is not guaranteeing this. Normally, any loan you get, the state guarantees it. Financing, the contracts could be awarded to anybody. It's not tied to, say, if you get a loan from the UK, you have to go to a UK company to build it. It could be built by the best suitable contractor to build the project. Creditors were not allowed to intervene in canal operations at all. And it was a 20-year loan with a 10-year grace period. So that's the key takeaway that I wanted to leave behind, is that it's good to have plans, but you need to have a very good plan and have upper hand in negotiating financing terms. Always have upper hand. So I'm going to move a little bit into a separate thing. So it's the next section is about the benefits of infrastructure are real, right? I know in the morning we talked a lot about the development impacts. I just want to highlight a study that was done about 10 years ago, about 6-7 years ago, on the A6-A9 road, just to exemplify that infrastructure is critical, right? It was a 10-year analysis of the road that was built, rehabilitated in 1987 by the ADB. That is the Kurunagal Ambepusa Road and the Kandy Jaffna Road. And the benefits are real tangible benefits. In terms of revenue increase, what the study found was that firms at the firm level, revenue increased by 70%. The size of firms increased by 77%, and the shift in the capital labor ratio, the firms became more capital intensive. So this is when we talk about production function and the productivity effects of firms, what's known as a technological coefficient increased, right? So the capital labor ratio of firms also increased. So that means they became more productive because of the road. From a household perspective, 80% higher average. Now, this is all controlling for the natural increase in wages as well. Employment shifted towards less labor-intensive factors, and then education also became a statistic. So that's just to identify that infrastructure is critical. We are at a critical juncture that we should never discount the fact that that when people say, hey, we are building too much infrastructure, that's not correct. You need a lot of infrastructure, but you need smart infrastructure. That gets to the final section of my presentation, which is about the infrastructure demand is far exceeding supply, right? The government's ability to supply. This infrastructure development cannot be a solely government-led effort. The private sector has to be included in this because the government will never have enough money to support the supply. This is a global problem. It's not just in Sri Lanka. For example, US is it's not building additional capacity, it's maintaining the existing capacity. So maintenance is as important as building new capacity. For example, US, the infrastructure grade given by the American Civil Society, Society of Civil Engineers, is a D+. It's poor to failing in terms of all, from dams to drinking water to hazardous waste. The infrastructure is crumbling there. They've come up with innovative ways to finance and develop their infrastructure, which we could learn from as well. The economic impact to the US in terms of this failing infrastructure is real as well. In terms of, it's felt at a household level. You have per capita, $1,000 per capita per person per year. It's going to be lesser because of the failing infrastructure. For businesses, there'll be about 877,000 jobs lost because of the failing infrastructure. And then country as a whole also loses because they can't compete with other emerging countries like China and other countries which have spent a lot on infrastructure. So US has realized this and they are spending their money. So there's a critical question. Infrastructure demand is far exceeding government's ability to do it. What can be done, right? What can we do? First thing is, I think we need to recognize the fact that it's not all about supply. It's not about building, which is critical, but it's also about other factors. Got to reduce waste. Don't let political decisions drive the construction or drive the planning. It should be economics. What's best for the country, not the short term, but with the long term view in mind. Have to implement demand curbing mechanisms and got to be, foster innovation, which is the next session is about technology. How do we leapfrog, learn from other countries? And then there needs to be a fundamental shift in how we fund infrastructure. Just breaking down into these four, just want to go through each one of them in more detail. Not all infrastructure investments are good. This is an example from Alaska, right? I didn't want to use the typical Sri Lankan example that we all, you guys have heard over and over again. It happens everywhere. Ted Stevens, a senator from Alaska, for a number of years lobbied and got approved $398 million to build a bridge. This is the first picture on top. That's a it's a animation. It's not a real thing. That bridge was going to be longer than the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and higher than the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. For what? To connect two islands, of one with 9,000 people, one with 50 people. So it's really a waste of money, and that happens everywhere in the world. And we need to have mechanism, internal processes in place as a nation to not allow these. The more interesting thing about this bridge to nowhere was Alaska got some of the funding in, and they recognized that they couldn't return the funding unless they built something. So what did they go ahead? They went ahead and built a road that connects to the bridge, but no bridge. So that's a picture of the road that was built for $25 million. It's wasteful spending. So, and I'm sure we can come up with many examples in Sri Lanka as well, that this type of wasteful spending happens. Second is curbing demand. I'm not going to go into the different things, because I know in the morning sessions we really covered all of these, but it's critical that we we pay attention to this. This is not a favorable option for the government because as consumers, you and I don't like this. This is going to affect us. And then game changers, innovations. So that's another thing that we need to work on. My last set of slides is about transportation, funding. We need 3.8% of global GDP is used for infrastructure right now. Needs to increase to 5.6. And in South Asia, especially 10% of all GDP should be going into infrastructure. I'll skip this slide, but go into the last few slides, which is basically one of the common conceptions is, hey, we can't get the private sector involved because we don't want to sell off our national assets, right? That's a big P word, the privatization. But there's a lot in between privatization and solely government control. And those are some of the mechanisms my colleagues will elaborate on. The second impediments are at the investor level. There used to be scale, longer pay period, illiquidity. Those were issues that private investors had in investing in infrastructure. They are no longer there. Now, infrastructure funds have matured and recognize that these are good investments. So the so-called impediment of scale, longer payback, that's not there anymore. But at a country level, these impediments are there, especially for Sri Lanka. We have a lack of pipeline of properly structured projects. I mean, we can't market ad hoc one project here, one project there. We need to have a national, a proper pipeline where private investors can come and select and choose, hey, these are good projects, these are bad projects, have IRRs done for them, etc. And the second 2 points is the institutional aspect of it, legal as well as political. These have to be recognized and rectified. So my last slide that I'm going to leave here with, and we can pick this up during the discussion as well, is there's a lot of, these are some of the private funds that are out there. I worked with 7 of these guys, so there's a lot of dry powder. These are all the dry powder that is available as of today to invest in infrastructure funds, right? The question is, are we ready to attract these guys and make use of this funding? Great, thank you.
Thank you, Kumudu. I think from his presentation, some take-homes, clearly, I think he said they actually went and got a vote. They voted for the Panama Canal. That would be a first in this country if we can do it. So, but I think the key thing is some of this has to be in public domain. You have to buy in the public. And that's, I think even yesterday we had someone who was talking about diplomacy. So you have to buy in and you cannot leave them out saying they are ignorant or, you have to give them their due place. And that's one. The other is the funding. There are myriad of mechanisms of funding. Financial closure is the most difficult part of the project. You can do all the fancy planning. You can get plenty of designers for which you'll pay probably top dollar. And you can set up a super one-stop shop for everything. We already have one-stop shop. Thilan will probably talk about it more. But but it hasn't worked because financial closure hasn't happened actually in many cases. So thank you, Kumudu. And our next speaker is Arnu. He's from HSBC. Over to you, Arnu.
Hi, my name is Arnaud Cachat. I work for HSBC. And as the first banker on to speak, I was expecting a big because I've heard a few possibly unrealistic expectations. I've only had a few words with Guido, but he said there's plenty of money. Availability is not an issue. Did you say that? You did say that. Yes, there's another panelist said, define what your priorities are, the money will come. So I'm really glad that everybody has confidence in us to bring it. I was a little bit taken aback by my colleague here who said that you should never let them have the upper hand in a negotiation. I can tell you I've never felt I had the upper hand in any negotiation, but we still managed to get business done. So, look, I've been listening very carefully to the presentations, the discussions. It is quite inspiring to hear really a lot of great ideas being put there. I'm not going to make you dream. I'm sorry to say, this will be maybe managing your expectations here. We see ourselves more as an enabler of projects, of good projects. And I'll try to bring a couple of ideas really only. Two parts to my presentation. The first part, I will present to you simply one source of funding, which is something that commercial banks can bring together with public authorities from around the world. So that's called ECA financing. ECA stands for Export Credit Agency, and some of you may be familiar, some of you may not be. I'll go to some details there. And then I'll simply use an example of a structure that we have put in place around the world and that we could implement here in Colombo or in Sri Lanka. I'm not saying this is the solution. I'm just saying this is one example of how we have worked with public and private sector stakeholders to make projects happen. Right. And I'm a banker, so I'm technologically challenged. How does that work? You see? No, it's not working. It's not me. Well, maybe it's me. Okay. All right. Okay. So is it projecting? Yes, it is. Okay. Right. ECAs. So I have explained ECA financing is Export Credit Agency financing, and the title of this seminar is Making Colombo a Globally Competitive City. And I will simply make a case that ECA financing is a globally competitive source of financing. So what is it? What is ECA? Simply think of it as it's an attractive source of financing for imported goods and services. A lot of infrastructure will require imported goods and services. This is used worldwide, particularly in emerging markets. What it involves is involves is credit enhancement or direct lending by export credit agencies. Export credit agencies are agencies with sovereign or quasi-sovereign status from exporter countries or from countries where investors are going and expanding overseas. And these agencies are set up to support exports, to support investment in more difficult markets, typically. Historically, this was designed to finance international trade, but this is now increasingly applied to support investment, overseas investment by companies. Therefore, it's not necessarily linked anymore to actual contracts of export of goods and services. Could be simply an overseas investor wanting to bring FDI into Colombo or into Sri Lanka. It's been consistently used. So I've been based in Asia for 10 years. I've worked in all these countries that I've listed there: China, India, Indonesia, very large economies, but also maybe smaller economies such as Bangladesh, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Vietnam. But it's also being used by all sorts of countries. The UK uses export credit into the UK. Australia does, Hong Kong does, Korea, etc. Primarily, international banks would be bringing this funding to you, to the country. However, this may be less relevant to our discussion today, but there are also capital market solutions to bring maybe additional liquidity for those mega projects that require additional liquidity. All sectors can be recipients of this funding. Infrastructure, in particular, can receive it. This is particularly true for water projects, for power projects, transportation projects such as rail, buses, etc. The resources sector, the telecom sector are recipients as well. Okay, how does it work? I'm not going to spend too much time there, but initially you have an exporter and a borrower. They agree on a commercial contract. The borrower, maybe the investment is a bit too large for the borrower's immediate financial capability. So the exporter will bring a financing solution together with them, and this will be implemented by a lender and an ECA, an export credit agency, that will help finance the trade. So from two people agreeing on a contract, you have to then involve 4 people at least to agree on the contract and its financing and its implementation over time. You'll be glad to know that I heard maybe my colleagues say that some of the financing shouldn't be tied to a particular country where you're buying. Well, the good news here is that you have the choice when you are purchasing equipment, because there's really pretty much every country or every significant exporter has an export credit agency that can support their exports. I haven't listed it there, but Malaysia has an export credit agency. South Africa would have, etc. So these are just examples, but we work with more than 30 export credit agencies worldwide. I hope one of them would be relevant to your projects. Some key considerations there, especially for infrastructures and for city infrastructures. Export credit agencies will bring you long-term funding to be put in play in front of the economic life of assets that you are putting in place. So typically 10 years, 15 years can be considered. If you enter into limited recourse, so public-private partnership type of funding, we may extend it to 20 years or even more. I just want to manage expectations here. This may not be available immediately in Sri Lanka, but maybe one of the other speakers may be able to offer this. We do bring competitive all-in cost. So this is important when you are looking at the economic impact of the infrastructure being put in place. Very large amounts can be raised, so we will do very small, maybe $10 million, $20 million investments. We can also finance very large investments, multiple billion dollars. It really depends on the type of infrastructure and its economic value. Especially relevant maybe here, we are able to finance 100% of a project. Not always, but typically we would look to provide you with a 100% financing package when it makes sense, or if it's a government buying, when the government requires it. Fixed interest rate, in a low or benign interest rate environment, this may not be your priority, but those interest rates will one day move up, and this could be a significant constraint, a significant burden on any infrastructure that is put in place with additional cost of servicing the debt. So fixed interest rates will be key. multi-source direct funding. This is maybe a little bit too technical here. I won't go into this. I would mention one final thing here on the multiple benefits of ECA financing is that ECAs can act as a catalyst for investments, whereby with export credit agencies you can mobilize other forms of funding that may be necessary. So commercial forms of funding, for example. Rapid execution. Well, so far I've never seen anyone not complaining about ECAs for their pace, but we make efforts there. Now, some examples, very quickly, a couple of examples in Sri Lanka. Well, this is phase 2, so we did also do phase 1, but a couple of years ago, we helped put together a $70 million package for the regional bridge program that was implemented by a UK exporter, successful project. So bridges can be exported very recently this year. This is maybe not a critical transportation infrastructure, but this is something that actually helps the country, we believe, very much. We help to finance equipment for the milk factory for dairy processing equipment. This came from Denmark. This is almost $70 million financing, and will save the country a lot of foreign exchange in substituting imports with locally produced goods. Now I'll move out of Sri Lanka for a second. Well, no, actually I'm not moving out of Sri Lanka, just to give you an example of maybe a slightly larger project that we financed using, and I'm counting now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different ECAs were put together in this package to finance a gas-fired power plant near Colombo in Kerala. Moving out, but slightly bigger stage, Vietnam, for Petro Vietnam, we financed a coal-fired power plant recently. Almost $1 billion of funding can be raised with Korean ECAs and Japanese ECAs. In Bangladesh as well, $420 million, 4 ECAs, as well as MIGA, part of the World Bank, mobilized to provide funding. I'm mentioning these countries because these are challenging markets for private banks to go and offer cross-border funding and long-term funding. However, with export credit agencies, you can make this happen and get unprecedented amounts of funding raised for critical infrastructure, power being a critical infrastructure pretty much everywhere in Asia, but particularly in those countries in Vietnam and Bangladesh. A little bit further down the line, and maybe closer to our transportation requirements, earlier this year we financed a $500 million or euro equivalent rail track in Azerbaijan, a country that has similar level of GDP as Sri Lanka. Now, second part, and I appreciate I'm maybe running out of time, but I want to give this example. BRTs. This has been mentioned a few times already during this seminar. The city of Bogota has been mentioned as having solved their transportation problems. I'm not sure BRT is the only solution that they had, but they did implement a BRT there. I must say this is not necessarily our preference. So I love trains, I love monorails as well. I love my car, and I love cycling. But BRTs have been implemented globally, and I'll maybe move there to a map that would show here. So these are some of the examples of BRT projects. HSBC is proud to say that we are probably the leading bank in terms of implementing BRT structures around the globe, and very successfully. We started some time ago with a project in Chile called Transantiago, which was extremely successful. I'll bring the case study later. But globally, this is a structure that works for local transportation requirements, where cities or clusters of cities need to improve traffic congestion, to improve their infrastructures, and find solutions, talking to getting private and public stakeholders together. I would have a lot more to say, but I will have to go quickly. What does Export Credit Agency bring to the table there in BRTs? They bring low cost of funding. They do not use local market risk appetite, so local players will still be able to benefit from their existing banking lines. They bring long-term repayment, therefore you can match the concession revenues with the repayment. And the ECAs are flexible, even though they are government entities. They are actually extremely flexible when problem comes, and problems will come over time. One more thing, I think in any project, the role of the bank is not going to be just bringing the money and making a big check, although that's a significant role that we have. Just to give you the example of BRTs, and again, this is only an example. We have been fulfilling a number of roles in terms of helping parties, public and private sector parties, negotiate frankly, a contract, negotiate a financing package, mitigate risk, allocate risk adequately, and ultimately making a success. Final, I promise, this is the final. This is a nice picture, but this one, Transantiago in Chile is a bit of a poster child of this type of financing. This is a reasonably large amount of funding that was raised, $700 million. This was not done in one go, over time, over several phases, but this involved two very efficient ECAs, EKN of Sweden, who supported a well-known exporter of buses, as well as Nexi of Japan, who supported a ticketing system that was provided by a Japanese supplier. The Nordic Investment Bank as well was an actor. So again, not quite an ECA, but maybe a development financial institution. It's a very, very large amount of money. It has been running for now the best part of 8 years. It has been extremely successful, and we could talk maybe offline on the successes. There are challenges. There are concessions being renegotiated with the government, and this causes problems. This causes waivers to the financing. So this is not all trouble-free, but in the end, we're still friends, and they're still servicing the debt. So any more questions? Maybe later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu. I think from key takeaway there was ECA funding, which is just one type of mechanism, and he made it look very attractive, but believe me, it's very complicated when it comes to giving you the money. Now, why are we in this situation? We must not forget, Sri Lanka runs massive deficits, and we as a government cannot really do government-to-government financing the way they did in the past, and it's becoming even more difficult. And on top of it, if they were to borrow, there's a high cost of borrowing. We've just paid 6.85% for $1.5 billion. So that's your backdrop, and we need to build the infrastructure for a lot of reasons which we've discussed, GDP, all of that. So if you want growth and you want to do this, the mechanism we are trying to look at is PPP. That is a message that we are trying to move into, because that makes it viable. You can make it viable through very complex and maybe even in some cases more simplistic mechanisms. But this is what we are searching for. So with that backdrop, third speaker is Yasushi. He's from JICA, and he also bears the same name as a more prominent Japanese person who we all come to know in the past. I think Mr. Akashi, who was what we call a shuttle diplomat. But Yasushi today is going to talk about his experience of JICA projects here and maybe project pipeline. Over to you, sir.
All right. Hello, my name is Taira. I'm from Japan International Cooperation Agency. Although my first name is Yasushi, I have nothing to do with Mr. Akashi, for sure. I am no relatives to him. So let me start from who we are. My colleague Arnold explained the ECA finance. JICA is a different official creditors. Right. JICA is the Japanese governmental agency executing the official development assistance. So we are a little bit different animals because the seminar is more or less oriented to the private sector development. So the official development assistance is defined as the activity undertaken by the government or government agency to promote economic development and welfare with the concessional terms. So our activities in Sri Lanka, we are providing the technical cooperation and the concessional loan and grant assistance, and also we are sending the volunteers. During my presentation, I pretty much focus on the concessional loan part. So our contribution to Sri Lanka, like 21% of the power generation capacity comes from our loan operation, and 24% of the pipe warm water comes from our loan, and 48% of the operational expressways we supported. Actually, this September, outer circular highway, part of it is open, so it's more than 50%, I guess, right now. Okay. So concessional loan. The concessional loan should be low interest rate and a long-term repayment period. Here is the example of the JICA's concessional loan terms. There are several options, but the most concessional loan is the step terms with the 0.1% interest rate and 40 years repayment period. It's so concessional, I guess. Basically, we are a non-profit making agency, so we are not competing with the private sectors. That's why we do not finance the commercially viable projects. Right. And the worldwide, our average interest rate is 0.37%, and the average maturity is 36 years, including the 10 years grace period. So we are pretty much providing the very, very concessional loan to the worldwide developing countries, including Sri Lanka. This step loan, the most of the large-scale infrastructure project we finance in Sri Lanka is this step conditions. So the most concessional terms, like BIA expansion project and outer circular highway, and also the new Kelani Bridge project, which will come in a couple of years. The step loan condition applies to the project which benefit from the Japanese technologies. Then the eligible bidders will be Japanese companies and Japanese or Sri Lankan joint ventures. Right. Here is the problem. As the international sovereign bond issuing is increasing and also the non-concessional borrowing is increasing, then the average borrowing interest rate is getting higher and higher, as you can see from this diagram. Therefore, it is imperative for the government of Sri Lanka to utilize the concessional loan as much as possible. And also there is another issue. Sri Lanka is approaching toward the upper middle income countries, something like the $4,000 income per capita annual. Currently, Sri Lanka's per capita income is something like 3,700. So in a couple of years, Sri Lanka will be the upper middle income countries. But according to the international rule, once the Sri Lanka becomes the upper middle income countries, we cannot provide the most concessional loan, and also we cannot provide the large-scale infrastructure finance. That's why within this couple of years, it is the time to utilize the concessional loan for the public investment purpose. Here are some macroeconomic conditions. Average fiscal deficit remained pretty much same, it's stable, even though the revenue is decreasing, because the government has been reducing the capital investment to reduce the expenditure. So the government now needs to reinvigorate the capital investment for the prioritized projects. And also there is the deteriorating performance of the export industries. Therefore, the government needs to improve the investment climate to promote the foreign direct investment to Sri Lanka. Well, then how? There are something what we can do, we can support. The first one is the large-scale infrastructure finance, because the investment cost is too high, and there are great uncertainties at the several factors. Then the private investment will be discouraged. Therefore, there is a necessity to support economically viable public investment. Even though it's financially or commercially non-viable, there is a justification to do that project if it's economically viable. Here is the example in India. JICA financed the Delhi Metro Rail project. We provided the concessional loan to the government of India. So far, we provided like $5 billion, and we are still keeping supporting. And the government of India is the borrower, and the government of India and the government of Delhi, a state government, provides the equity to the Delhi Metro Railway Corporation. Then DMRC is operating this Delhi Metro Rail. Now they are carrying the 2.6 million daily passengers with more than 200 kilometers network with more than 200 train sets. And also this operation and maintenance costs is being covered through not only the fare box, but also the property business, as the Nayan from UDA mentioned during the morning session. This land property business is a key to make the operation sustainable. So, okay. Some people talks about PPP, especially the government guys. Government guys somehow likes to talk about PPP. It may work in some cases, like for some project with the foreign currency revenue earnings, and also there is stable and predictable demand, like port operation or the power generation. Sometimes PPP works, but none of them will apply to the public transport, because usually the fare is politically set quite low, and also there is a huge ridership risk. Therefore, PPP typically doesn't apply to the public transport project. There are some examples from India. The Delhi Airport Express line, in a government provided concession to the private operators, but in a couple of years, concessionaire exited from the business, and they sold the business to actually this DMRC guy. Now it's publicly operating. There's another example from the Chennai monorail. The governments tried to float the bid, and they did a couple of times, but still no successful bid yet. So Right. We have been providing large-scale infrastructure finance, but we cannot keep putting the public money forever. So here comes the another role for the concessional loan. At initial stage, there is a huge cost and the risk. Therefore, the public entity can bear the cost and share the risk through the public investment toward the concessional loan. Therefore, which will lead to the commercially viable foundation for the subsequent private investment. And here is a nice example here, the Colombo port. For the old Colombo port part, JICA provided like something like 10 loans from the 1980. Then the Colombo port was fully developed. The Unity Container Terminal, Jaya Container Terminal, and the QEQ. Then after that, here comes the South Asia Gateway Terminal. It's now privately operated. So the first public investment, then private investment comes after. Same model applies to the South Harbor. ADB financed the foundation part. Then the Colombo International Container Terminal comes in as privately operated. So it's kind of successful model for the public to private sequent cooperation. So we are basically G2G guy, government to government. So the standard case, we provide loan to government to Sri Lanka as the borrower. But in some exceptional case, we provide a loan directly to public entity, non-government guy, I mean the quasi-public guy as the borrower with sovereign guarantee. Here in Sri Lanka, we have one example. That's the BIA expansion project. We provide a loan to the airport authority and with the sovereign guarantee from the government. Any implications for the future project? If there is financially sound public entity which we can provide a direct loan, perhaps we can do that. Although the sovereign guarantee is the prerequisite. Another example, through this huge public investment, we provide a broad-based economic growth basis. Sri Lanka's example is the Southern Expressways. This is the first expressway in this country that was parallel financed by ADB and us. We share the common environmental and social guidelines to start the construction. It opened in 2011. After 2011, the traffic volume increased from 8,000 to 24,000. And the GDP share of the southern province increased from 8.9% to 11%. And also the poverty level decreased from 11% to 6.3%. So this Southern Expressway is contributing to the economic development and the social welfare of the southern province. My last slide. Sometimes private financial flow is pretty much volatile. In Sri Lanka's case, there was a tsunami in 2004 and the Lehman shock in 2008. Then the private financial flow kind of suddenly decreased. But the official creditors, it was kind of stable and the counter-cyclical role we are taking. So the message here is whatever happens, we official creditors will always be there to support government of Sri Lanka. That's it. Thank you.
LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2015, making Colombo a globally competitive city. Sponsors.
Welcome to Cinnamon Life, Colombo's iconic life capital in the making, a landmark project by Sri Lanka's premier conglomerate John Keys Holdings PLC, designed by renowned architect and engineer Cecile Balmont. Cinnamon Life will celebrate the emergence of the new Sri Lanka.
HSBC, we understand when it's your business. It's never just business.
Who knows? One of these kids just might be the one to clean the oceans, start a movement, or lead a country. It may not be obvious yet, but one of these kids is going to change the world. We just need to make sure she has what she needs. Welcome to Windows 10. The future starts now for all of us.
LBR LBO Infrastructure Summit 2015.
Thank you, Yasushi. I think after a very somber session, 2 sessions in the morning, we have some light at the end of the tunnel. JICA has capacity to finance. We have done extensive research and feasibility, and there is an identified dire need for an MRT. They've financed the MRT. So Nayana, your first tick box, you can tick now. And there's Hitachi that will supply you the rolling stock. So we have a project, correct? It's not that easy, again. So it's all about, priorities. Do you have the project pipeline? What is feasible? What is financially attractive? That's finally what actually builds the project. So we've had the 3 presentations, and also joining us in the panel is Amali from the World Bank, and Thilan, who chaired the session earlier. I'm going to start off with the Q&A with Thilan, because he has the inevitable position of being in a one-stop shop setup that we had, which probably goes back a long way in time. And what I'd like to ask him in particular is, there was a PPP unit set up within the BOI, and a lot of discussion was made about whether we need to have one large entity that cuts through everything. So the question really I'm going to put to him is, can the BOI do the job? Do they have the capacity to do it? And or do we need a super agency on top of it? And also maybe he could share a little bit of the insights into one of the first PPPs that was successfully implemented, the South Asia Gateway Terminal. Thilan?
Can you hear? Okay, for the benefit of those who are not familiar, because I left the I left the position of chairman BOI in 2001, a long time ago. However, just to give you very briefly, I actually was an investment banker when I joined BOI. I was a founder of Asia Capital. I sold my stake, joined the board of investment. And I then realized that there was an opportunity for PPPs, and the USAID had funded some technical assistance for PPP projects, and the Ministry of Finance had not been able to financially close even a single project. So that $2 million line of grant funding for technical assistance, I got it assigned to the Board of Investment and created a unit called the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment, and hired people paying them market rates to bring in the skills that the government didn't have at the time. And those are primarily financial structuring skills and legal skills. Specialist technical skills, which we had to source from overseas, I was able to fund through the USAID line of grant funding. So my fellow panelists here on the right was part of that team. And yes, we managed, and this is during a period where the country was at war, where there was a risk premium attached to funding projects. We managed to financially close genuine PPPs with no sovereign guarantees attached to it, financially close, $800 million between 1996 and 2000, 2001, covering ports, telecom, and several sectors. Now, this is what was what happened at the time. We can do it. Coming to, so in summary, the reason why it happened was that we had the funding, we had the people who brought in the skills that the government didn't have. In terms of SAGT, I think that was the crowning glory in terms of a transaction done by the BII. And I think I must correct my fellow panelist. I very much appreciated the JICA funding for the Jaya container terminals, but in the case of QEQ, JICA only funded the feasibility study for the expansion of QEQ. The physical infrastructure expansion of QEQ was entirely private sector driven, John Keel's P&O. And if I look at the difference between the concessionary funding proposal and the private sector proposal, there was one fundamental reason why we actually cancelled the JICA loan to go with the private sector, and that is to introduce competition to the port of Colombo so that the port will never go on strike. And that's precisely what I went and told the president, Your Excellency, the port is a national asset. We cannot have a single operator within the port. We must have multiple operators. So that was the ground, that was the basis on which why we went to the private sector, not because we, as Sri Lankans, we didn't find Japanese loans unattractive. They're very attractive. The second point is that what we also found that the private sector funding and the private sector proposal was far more efficient in terms of $1 spent on QEQ. The private sector proposal was able to attract more than 2 times the number of TEUs that the JICA proposal was able to put on the table. So as of today, I believe QEQ is generating about 2 million TEUs, and the Port Authority gets revenues of more than $30 million from SAGT doing nothing. So that's basically the background in terms of the question that Maninda asked.
Thank you, Tilan. From what he said, his key thing was they identified the Colombo port as a national asset. So priority, we have such assets in the balance sheet of the government. And I think we need to identify and prioritize. As Dr. Kumarage or one of the speakers earlier mentioned, I'm sorry, maybe not Dr. Kumarage, Dr. Gunarwan spoke about that we went and built the highways first. And that maybe there were other assets that could have been developed in priority. But sometimes governments are forced to take certain decisions based on what kind of financing is available and what is a low-hanging fruit. That could also be a reason. And I would also add, we do need highways because there are more than enough reasons to justify. I think Kumul's presentation spoke of developing roads and highways does contribute to GDP. Now, from there, Amali, who has also worked on a lot of World Bank projects, probably has identified possibly some of the project pipeline. Amali, would you be able to share with us, apart from the port, any other important national assets that we could farm out on the same basis, open to competition and get the benefit to the country? Would you be able to share something?
I think this is technically an evaluation that the government needs to do, because it needs to decide what kind of financing is being used for what sort of projects. But I think there are lots of projects. I mean, Amal himself was saying in the urban transport plan, there's half of it that can be financed through private investment. So there's lots in transport, there is in power, water. So all of these sectors are open. So it's a question of government doing the correct evaluation and identifying what really can be financed through the private sector.
Interesting. Before we could get even to the railway, I have a question. Do we have enough power to supply the electrification of the railway? Now, why is the power monopoly with the state? I mean, isn't there a PPP we can do for power, energy? Why only tiny little bits of renewable energy, I believe capacity spoken of up to about 200 megawatts, whereas one large plant will give you 750 megawatts if you want. Any thinking?
Well, there are several power plants. I think one of the things that HSBC presentation was the West Coal power plant, which was combined cycle power plant. I think there are over 700 to 800 megawatts of private power in the system at the moment. So there are opportunities for other areas as well. I mean, if the CB wants to move with natural gas, for example. So there are a lot of opportunities that you can harness for private investment. And that has been done in the past.
Right. So looking at what came up in all the previous discussion was clearly public transport. And there were two schools of thought. One is that the existing omnibus transport system, the bus transport system can be improved, which is like a low-hanging fruit. And then you have, of course, the mass rapid transit system, which is going to be costlier and needs to be probably studied more, or maybe that is available, but we don't know. One of the other things that I think that probably leads to a lot of doubt is actually a lot of this information is not available in the public domain. And I think today, in the modern sense, information is currency. A lot of these things need to be in public domain so that people can, even investors, even investment can flow. Some of these things are probably languishing in a report somewhere. No one even knows about it. I would like to ask Kumudu on that note, what would you say, would a mass rapid transport system be viable and looking at the current and the future growth? And if it's not, how do we make it viable via maybe a structure that you spoke of on a PPP?
Sorry, the question is mass transportation viable?
I mean, it is already been identified as something that would be key as to be competitive and drive Colombo there. So if that's the case and the cost is quite high, how do we make it feasible? There are probably mechanisms for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as my colleague from JICA mentioned, and I think you also mentioned that public transportation is one of the tougher aspects to get private funding into because of the cost elements associated with it. And there's some examples in few countries, but they are not large-scale projects. So any large-scale projects really needs to go through the government G2G type model. But having said that, I mean, there's innovation happening all the time. So there may be sections of a transit system. If it's a BRT system, for example, you get a BRT system, say, what's the often traveled road? Rajagiri Road is always congested. I'm sure people would pay money if there is a good air-conditioned BRT system. Now, problem with BRT is the climate, right? Sri Lanka climate is not conducive. It rains all the time. So you have to have some type of mechanism of park and ride type facilities, etc. But that type of public transportation, there's a potential of attracting private capital. But a monorail, I mean, I'm sure Anand will talk more about it, but the IRRs won't be there to attract private capital for that. On another point, just one thing on the energy side of it, I think we're talking a lot about transportation here, and we're forgetting about all the other infrastructure that really drives the economy. I mean, our pipe system, for example, I don't know how old it is. So energy, for example, the solar batteries that are coming out, there are a lot of innovations in terms of, Elon Musk talks about having solar farms. Those batteries are cheap. The Chinese guys are now producing those batteries, a very cheap thing. Are we looking at these innovations to actually connect these solar farms type technologies to the grid? So that's
true. Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. Like land, labor, capital, which the economists you learn are the fundamentals. Electricity is probably the most important one in a modern economy. Maybe we are paying far too much per unit cost. Would you like to share something? What do you think in your international experience? What do you think our tariffs are like? Can we be more competitive, opening it up?
Well, I wouldn't want to comment on whether your tariff is too high or too low. What I would confirm, though, is that power generation assets are the most common type of infrastructure that can be privatized or that can be funded with the participation of the private sector. Simply because, well, this is the economic fundamentals are well known, well understood. The government support for it in the sense of a public sector off-taker of the power and who will then transport it and distribute it is usually very, it's a very well comprehended model. So yes, definitely power sector is an infrastructure that should be prioritized in terms of developing those public-private partnerships. And in fact, it is the case already to some extent, but there's always more that can be done. And across Asia, we are seeing very large power plants being built using private equity investments and private funding.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to that, PPP in private in power generation. Interestingly, one of the big parameters that are used is cost per unit, yes. And that's the advantage because you have different. What a government then does is it creates an enabling environment, and you have this innovative technology that will bid on the basis of cost per unit. So in the end, it is the end user who gets the benefit of that, which is what's important. Right now, if you talk of electricity in Sri Lanka, the policymakers are saying, oh, we give you 24 hours uninterrupted power. That's better than the brownouts in India, the blackouts in the Philippines, and some no power in some countries, and that is enough for competitive advantage. Would you think that's enough?
Well, I come from a country where the state is totally dominant in the power sector, by the way. But no, look, depending on the stage of the country, but you're right. The argument, which is I'll give you 24/7 power, is good, but it's not sufficient. And in fact, what we are seeing is that the introduction of independent power producers has typically brought costs down. So has brought the cost of producing down and the efficiency up in the power sector. So it's not just 24/7 power; it's also affordable, efficient, and then ultimately a bit of competition has never hurt. And you're right, the end user is the ultimate beneficiary of it.
On the same side, we've had a lot of discussion. We've had numerous plans. We've had some forms of implementation, maybe even haphazard, but clearly, I think what's emerging is, and this is the message. In fact, there is a question that's been asked, is that what is deliberated in this forum, will it be heard by the powers that be, so that some of these ideas get into the implementation channel? So that's a challenge to LBR and to Lakshman. We can only do the talking. And we are also talking now about how to walk the talk by putting it on ground. Yasushi, you spoke of the Southern Expressway, and it was partly funded by JICA and ADB. there was an interesting number that was thrown at cost per kilometer. Would you endorse that as cost per kilometer for your Southern Expressway?
Right. Cost per kilometer discussion is very, very tricky. It's hardly comparable because the number comes up with different bases. So I have never seen fair comparison between those cost per kilometers discussions. Some people argue that the cost per kilometers for the expressway development in Sri Lanka is higher than other countries. Perhaps it might be true, but there should be some reasons. But I guess we have to examine what really the comparable cost per kilometers is.
I'm just for the benefit of all that everyone here, and it's good. What was the final cost per kilometer for the Southern Expressway?
Okay, I guess that I would say was very good. And
all right.
We really need to define what was the comparison basis, including which cost, like construction, land acquisition, or stuff like that.
Sure. I mean, it's all costs at the end of the day because somebody is paying for it. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to find out what is better, but I think we all, as I said, information is currency. We all have a right to know. If it can be shared, by all means, let us know. Because we are throwing numbers. We're saying $2 million a kilometer, $7 million a kilometer, all kinds of stuff. And in fact, it's frightening because if it is $7 million a kilometer, we'll have a queue outside wanting to build roads. But on the other hand, if it's 2, we might have fewer, and then we can build fewer roads. So that's the reason why I was asking. But anyway, we'll take it as the price was good. And move on.
But
sorry,
just a very quick comment. I think we're one of the question was, how is private funding going to come? Private funding will come where there is a good project. How do you define a good project? Well, there's a number of things. One of these things is transparency. So where the private investor and the private lenders and frankly, even the government lenders will be able to put their finger here on how much does it cost, and with parameters which are well understood. Typically, the power generation sector is a sector where everything is completely transparent, and the price per kilowatt hour is a true number. This is not tricky. This is not difficult. This is not debatable. This is well documented in the contract. So I think maybe there's a lesson here around the type of assets that can be funded by the private sector. Those are the assets where there's verifiable cost, verifiable economic metrics.
You want to add something?
Sure. Yeah. No. I think just to add on to it, the challenge. We are coming from an era of no bid contracts or one bid contracts, and now trying to go into privatizing. It's a very, the spectrum is large. So I think we shouldn't rush into stuff. What you said is exactly right. Transparency, and the institutions have to be ready. So we don't have the institutional capability right now in Sri Lanka to work with private institutions. Attract private institutions, one thing, but even to work with them to negotiate the proper terms and conditions, we don't have that right now. So we have to take it slow. I mean, the challenge for the politicians is we are running on a 5-year election cycle, trying to get a project off the ground and get some traction before the next election. So that's where we have to kind of slow down a little bit and get the institutions also in place.
So we heard a lot of chatter earlier. Really, we don't have the luxury of time. Apparently, we are on borrowed time. So if we want to speed things up, what would you think is because again, Tilan, I was asking is, if these existing structures and institutions are not working, and we've known, I mean, all the studies indicate that what's coming is like a tsunami, it's building up the longer we wait. So don't you think that as policymakers, a lot of the do's should be already in place? It's a question of then legislation or whatever, but do you want to add something to how do we?
More than legislation, it is really institutional capacity and leadership. We are a nation that has not had a full-time finance minister for most parts of the last 25 years. We are a nation that has changed policies dramatically from time to time. For example, sad to say, the BII is defunct. BOI has absolutely no institutional capacity today to structure a PPP project. Now, in a situation where we are going from one extreme to another, let me explain what I'm trying to say, is that we had an era ending 2014 where the name of the game is find a project, go to a government, foreign government, India, China, wherever, get a government guaranteed loan and build a bridge or build a highway. That's the easiest game in town. Now, what happened also in the last 9 to 10 years, there was a massive misallocation of resources from funds obtained from such sources. I don't need to mention what the white elephant projects are, but there are many. So today what we are saddled with is a problem, not just solving the country's transport or infrastructure problems, but to tackle that problem in a multifaceted way, because going back again to the late 90s, what really happened was PPPs were dovetailed with a program of privatization. I was involved very much in the privatization of Sri Lanka Telecom. It happened very tactically. There was not a one day of strikes that the trade unions went on. They were, by the way, sent to Chile and Argentina to study privatizations. What we did was we first brought in competition through the BOI. Lanka Bell and Suntel came before we privatized. Then we privatized Sri Lanka Telecom. It was a transparent process. There was an RFP. We appointed Deutsche Morgan Grenfell as our financial advisor. And there was a very structured process by which we went through. We had 3 bidders. In a war situation, mind you, we would have had about 10 if we didn't have a war. Korea Telecom, France Telecom, Japan Telecom. NTT gave the highest bid, and Sri Lanka Telecom was privatized. Now, similarly, what this government needs to look at is that PPPs need to be dovetailed with a program to do some structural adjustment on the country's balance sheet. Mass-scale privatizations are required. We need to privatize the power plants that are run by Lakdanavi and Lanka Transformers. Actually, the loans given are, I mean, all those companies are controlled by the CEB. For all intents and purposes, these are public sector corporations. We need to then use that money to restructure the country's balance sheet so that the country has the capacity to embark on PPPs and then have the brain trust back again, bring top-level investment bankers, local and international, appoint transaction advisors, tell them now, okay, is this project for JICA? Is this project for HSBC or public funding? And then work out RFP documents, go to the market, go to the multilateral donor agencies and figure out how to allocate these resources. It is just an exercise of resource allocation and project identification. It's not rocket science. So we need to build institutional capacity, and I believe we have a prime minister who very much understands what needs to be done. However, the reality is that we don't have the right politics to implement a lot of what I'm saying. So let us not expect wonders from Sri Lanka, but let us at least support the process that we need to privatize, we need to do PPPs, we need concessional funding, no question about it. But we need to build institutions, we need to bring in people, we need to tap the brain trust that's present here.
Thank you, Dylan. That was the answer I was looking for. Thank you. Amal, you want to add something to?
I mean, I just wanted to go back a little bit and also I endorse what Dylan was saying. And I think it's very important to build institutional capacity, because I think there was a trend in government at some point, 10 years ago, everybody was relying on consultants. And that model didn't really work. So over a period of time, it has been encouraged that the institutional capacity be built. And this is exactly what BII did, in a sense. It started off with a collection of consultants, international consultants who came and assisted the structuring of the transactions, legal expertise, all that. But after a while, the local expertise continued to build that capacity. But I also want to stress on this is the most important thing is clear and consistent government policy on this. And that to an extent is why, in a way, BII became defunct, because the government policy was not there for it to continue, because there was no private investment, there was no PPPs being mooted out, right? So I think that is where we need to start. But in terms of, just want to add on the transport sector, we're looking at a huge pipeline of things. And it's not only the transport sector. I mean, there's urban transport, there is, the government is currently talking about expressways, there is energy, there are education, health, huge amount of needs. So one needs to rationalize this and prioritize based on the capacity that is available, both material, human resources, institutional capacity, and also readiness for implementation. So before we get to the state of financing, I think all that needs to be looked at to understand what needs to come forward. So it's not that there are large numbers to fund today, but you need to make sure that the planning is done, the correct feasibilities are done to be able to get to where you want to go.
Kumudu, you have experience of, you've worked with the Panama Canal project, and it was huge. And as you said, it has gone through several evolving phases. Is there anything that comes to mind in Sri Lanka that comes close to that? That is one. And the other is, I want to ask you is, what about the financial markets here? I'm not sure whether you're familiar with some of that, but at the end of the day, your banking system, your capital market also must work, because if you're trying to give concession, you're creating SPVs, you need laws, and you also need to be able to secure cash receivables. You need to be able to tax people, tax authorities, all kinds of revenue systems have to be in place. So it's a loaded one. I would, in fact, encourage any of the panelists to join in this discussion, because this is a key element.
Sure, yeah. In terms of the loaded question, I'll get to the loaded question. In terms of projects similar to Panama Canal in Sri Lanka, it's really nothing that comes to mind off the bat. But in terms of, do we have the legal and financial frameworks in place to do private PPP deals? I'm not an expert on it, but the little I know, I don't think we do. I don't think we have the proper structures in place. I don't think our local banking system, and apologies for any bankers in the, I don't think they are also used to doing these type of transactions. Because when you are structuring a deal, it doesn't fit into a box. Oftentimes the box becomes a circle, and you need to adapt to it, and you need to have the processes in place to be able to adapt as you go. And our systems are very boxed natures. If it doesn't fit into that box, then that's rejected. So that's I don't know what others have.
In particular, Thilan, anything on the capital market that we need to do, or because in line with what we are thinking that we need, and while you're getting the expertise into the PPP office or the infrastructure office, and you're doing all of that, is there anything in the market itself, in the banking system or the capital market, that we should be doing?
Yeah, I think so. I think to build on what Kumudu said, in the 90s, late 90s, when we realized that the banking system did not have the capacity to lend over a term of, say, 12, 15 years, we created a company called PSIDC, Private Sector Infrastructure Development Company. And that company had multilateral funding. Am I correct, Mamali? We were the founder board members, I think. Multilateral funding that went into it, and that funding in turn went into private sector infrastructure related projects. So that was, we were augmenting what what the banking system lacked at the moment. So we could look at such structures in the future. And also in terms of capital markets, I think our capital markets are way too thin. And that's the reason why I have not been in investment banking since 1996. We need to, in fact, make our capital market more deeper and robust. State-owned institutions need to list their shares in the capital markets. Then they need to be managed like private sector institutions. And unless we broaden the depth and the breadth of our capital market with more companies that are attractive to institutional investors, we need to list SAGT. By the way, I don't know whether John Keels is present. It's written into the concession agreement. So we need some of these. I made a special effort to write it into the concession agreement. So we need such large-scale projects that are listable to be listed on our capital market, and then essentially that will broaden the amount of players, institutional investors who will come in to invest in the market, as opposed to 5 companies that foreign institutional investors are looking at the moment.
I think that is a very good point, because sometimes institutions here within the country, investment funds, don't have the capacity nor the appetite. So what you do really, you set the whole project going, and at some point you list it. And that's the way investment, smaller appetite, because half the risk is being taken off. And I think, Yasushi, you mentioned that sometimes JICA goes into a project and they give the credit profile the project needs, and then you move away. And then you could have other people coming in on the project once it's actually moving forward. Any thoughts on that?
Right. So that's one of the concessional loan lenders' role, to provide the basis for which the private investors feel comfortable to put money. One of the examples was the Colombo port. We hope we can make another examples in some time in future in Sri Lanka. But
so actually, there's one you talked about, get JICA funding, start a project, and then ultimate goal is listing. I think there's a middle step as well. If the project is making money, if the asset is making money, it's viable, you can bring in a private investor without listing it, like Macquarie, and most of the toll roads that are privatization that's happening in the US. That's all the private investors are coming into these projects that are making money. The risk has been taken by the development agencies by giving G2G loans, and we do have some of those projects, right? I mean, the airport expressway may be potentially making money. The Southern Expressway, I don't know the numbers, but 24,000 traffic, it has increased 3-folds, 4-folds right now. That could potentially be making money as well. So, in fact,
if I may add money, that's precisely the sort of securitization, government balance sheet strengthening that I was speaking about. In fact, when the CKE was first mooted, it was actually the BII that gave technical assistance to formulate the trace. I was a member of the TEC that designed this particular trace. There was a very dynamic engineer called Bertram Curray who said, no, we must not go inland, we must go on the other side and over the lagoon. But at that time, the CKE was mooted as a design, build, finance, privatized deal. You open it, do an RFP, open it out for international contractors who tie up with local contractors who will bring the financing. The project will be built with financing and a government guarantee. And after establishing certain levels of tolls, CKE would be privatized and retire certain amount of the debt. That was the model that was proposed. However, it went in a completely different direction, to the point where when the project was awarded to Kiang Nam, I refused to sign on the TEC document. I can say this very openly. I mean, I have nothing to hide. But and of course, at that time, the cost of the project was $130 million US, $140 million US. I believe when it was eventually built, it was 270 or 300. I may be wrong. So you can do some math adjusted for inflation and then work out your cost per kilometer.
Right. On that note, somebody in the audience who probably is privy to it has said that the expressway initially was at estimated cost as US dollars 348 million, ended at US $740 million for the 126 kilometers. As such, the cost per kilometer was established at a good $5.8 million finally. That like roughly works out to be the average between the 7 and the 2. Okay, thank you, whoever that is. So now we know what the cost is. But yeah, I think Ilan, that's a very valid mechanism, because we also look at some of these projects as, 10-year, 20-year, but when you do structure these things, and they are complex, but there are exit mechanisms. And this is how I would like to say, this is how capital markets grow. It's not necessarily that you go, correct me if I'm wrong, Tilan, that you go from one country to another, talking about the existing stock market, which is tiny, and there's like hardly a return we're talking about. But it is these kinds of projects that will increase the marketability of a capital market. So that's a message to the capital market players. And also, before you do that, if there are any laws that are in languishing, they need to be picked up and they need to be passed ASAP, because I know for one fact, the Securitization Act, which is fundamental to securitizing receivables, is languishing somewhere between the SEC and the government legislative body since 2004. So now it's 10 years obsolete.
Same with REITs, real estate investment trust. The legislation is yet to come.
So these are, while we talk about projects and project pipelines, there are some serious groundwork that needs to get done before you can do financial closure. And with financial closure, I'm hoping to bring this session to a closure because time's up. And amazingly, we've kind of stuck to it well. I hope we've given, I did not take very specific questions, but I think I've answered a lot of the questions that came up here through our discussion. If there's anything very, very specific, let me see. No, I think we've kind of more or less covered most of it. Just, I want to kind of wind up by saying that it boils down to the fact that I think what is required is a government that enables and also leaves. It might exit in 5 years, but for heaven's sake, leave the projects alone. They have to move on. So find the mechanism by which they continue even after you've long gone, and not necessarily go with you, because that's what's been happening. In fact, some of the good things also get shut down by doing that. So that's one. And is there anything you want to pass on the baton with? Yes, Sushi. As a closing remark.
Right. So in a couple of years, we might exit from the large-scale infrastructure finance business from Sri Lanka. Still, therefore, there are these 2 years, 3 years is the most key period which we really work hard to cooperate with the government of Sri Lanka to realize the Megapolis plan or other large-scale projects.
Anu?
Yes, I'll simply mention that we have been financing infrastructures in this country for many years, and will continue to do so. We'll be pleased to look at good projects, and just to maybe dovetail to the initial remark that was made on financing, there is plenty of funding available. We need good projects, and with that, we'll make it happen.
I'd like to say something in a more lighter way, and I'd like to demote ourselves from being a middle-income country in order to continue qualifying for JICA's most attractive window of funding, because we became a middle-income country through bloated white elephant, certain white elephant infrastructure projects. It was primarily on the back of public sector funding that our GDP per capita went to the level of a middle income country. So I'd like to demote ourselves a little bit, if you don't mind.
Kamali.
Well, I think we discussed a lot. It looks like our fiscal space is getting more and more smaller and smaller, and JICA seems to be moving out of concessional finance. Our funding levels are not that large either, so we're looking really at getting private sector involved in a lot of these infrastructure projects. What I would like to leave here with is to say, do we have the correct enabling environment? Is there an institution that takes this forward? Is there an enabling policy framework? Is there a pipeline? So I think this needs to be taken through with government in terms of discussing how do we take this forward.
Yeah, the one thing I would like to leave with basically, project finance is not a sexy thing. I'm sure you guys are bored out of your mind listening to this stuff. Whereas it's always fun to talk about a potential BRT, potential monorail, potential, all these graphics. But at the end of the day, if you have a bad finance deal, especially with the private sector, you're in for it for a long term. So it's very important, it's very critical that we get that right. And that's why I said, take our time in getting into PPPs, because you're dealing with sharks. And if you're not a shark, you're going to be eaten up. No offense to.
So thank you very much. And thank you very much to all the panelists and for the time and your presentation helped my job.
Thanks so much. Okay, we are doing fine with the time. Thanks to our speakers who stick to their allocated time, and also all the session chairs have been managing time very well, very skillfully. That's great. So we heard about the money part of the business. So since if I may remember, Professor Kumarge ended his presentation with a slide on the investment that would be required in the transportation front. And so here's an opportunity. The message is very clear. There is an opportunity for private sector to actively get involved in financing long-term infrastructure projects. And what is also coming out very clearly throughout all the sessions is there's a significant level of development required in governance, consistent policy development, and capacity building in terms of government sector, public sector institutions. I wish that we have some of these folks from Finance Ministry, Treasury, Physical Planning Department, and Megapolis are here. So we try our level best to engage these public institutions, and it's quite disappointing that some of these public sector institutions have not warmed up to create this dialogue with all the stakeholders. I hope that things will change in future. There will be much more open-minded people like Naina, okay, who will lead our public institutions, so we could have a healthy discussions between private sector, public sector, academia, researchers, development agencies, multilateral agencies, etc. So we are taking a break. It's 3:36 now. So we will meet again at 3:50 for the final session. The sad thing is that everybody says, okay, my section is not sexy. Project financing is not sexy. And I hope that next session is going to be really, really sexy. It's about leveraging technology. Thank you so much. Put your hands together and thank our speakers.